Sword Art Online Progressive, Book 1, written by Reki Kawahara. Chapter 2, Aria in the Starless Night. The moment she hit the floor, the only thought that passed through her brain was the mundane question. I wonder what happens when you pass out in a virtual world. Falling unconscious was a momentary shutdown of the brain, caused by the stoppage of blood flow. Blood might stop flowing for a variety of reasons: heart or blood vessel malfunctions, anemia, low blood pressure, hyperventilation. But under a VR full dive, the physical body was already utterly stationary in a bed or a reclining chair. On top of that, everyone stuck in this particular game of death had presumably been transferred to a nearby medical facility where they would be undergoing regular monitoring and administration of necessary drugs and fluids. It was hard to imagine someone passing out from purely physical reactions. These thoughts ran through her fading consciousness and eventually collected into a simple statement. I just don't care anymore. Nothing mattered. She was going to die here. If she passed out in the middle of a labyrinth guarded by deadly monsters, there was no way she'd emerge safely. There was another player nearby, but he wouldn't risk his own life just to save a stranger. Besides, how would he save her? The weight that a player could carry in this virtual world was strictly controlled by the game system. Deep in a dangerous dungeon like this, any player would be heavily laden with potions and emergency supplies, not to mention all of the loot they'd procured along the way. It was impossible to imagine anyone carrying another human being on top of all of that. She then realized something. For fleeting thoughts of escaping her brain just before she fell unconscious. They were certainly lasting quite a while. Plus, it was only hard stone beneath her body, so why did she feel something so soft and gentle pressing against her back? She felt warm somehow. There was even a light breeze tickling her cheek. With a start, her eyes snapped open. She wasn't in a dank dungeon surrounded by clammy stone walls. It was a clearing in the midst of a forest, surrounded by ancient trees engraved with golden moss and thorny bushes, bearing small flowers. She'd passed out. No, been sleeping. On a bed of grass, soft as carpet, in the middle of a round clearing, measuring roughly 8 yards across. But how? She'd lost consciousness deep in that dungeon, so how could she have traveled all the way to this outdoor area? The answer was 90 degrees to her right. There was a gray shadow huddled at the foot of an especially large tree at the edge of the open space. He cradled a large sword with both hands, and his head resting on the scabbard. His face was hidden beneath longish black bangs, but based on the equipment and profile, it had to be the player who'd been talking to her moments before she had passed out. He must have found some way to carry her out of the dungeon and into this forest. She scanned the line of trees until on her left she finally spotted a massive tower stretching upward to the roof, a few 100 feet away, the labyrinth of the first floor of Einkrad. She turned back to her right, perhaps sensing her movement. The man's shoulders twitched beneath the gray leather coat, and his head rose slightly. Even in the midst of the middy forest sun, his eyes were as black as a starless night. The instant she crossed gazes with those pitch-black eyes, a tiny firework went off deep in the back of her mind. "You shouldn't have bothered!" growled Asuna Yuki past gritted teeth. From the moment she'd been trapped in this world, Asuna had asked herself the same questions hundreds of times, if not thousands. Why did she decide to play with that brand new gaming console when it wasn't even hers? Why did she put the helmet on her head and sink into the high-backed mesh chair and utter the startup command? Asuna hadn't bought the Nerve Gear, VR interface of dreams turned crushed tool of death, or the game card for Sword Art Online, vast prison of souls, that had been her much older brother Korichigu. But even he'd never been one for video games, much less MMORPGs. As the son of representatives doctor at Rekt, one of the biggest electronics manufacturers in the country, he underwent every kind of education necessary to be their father's successor, and everything that didn't fall under that duty was eliminated from his life. Why he became interested in Nerf gear, why he chose SAO, was still a complete mystery to her. But ironically, Korichigu never got to play the first video game he'd ever bought. On the very first day that SAO launched, he was sent on a business trip overseas. At the dinner table the night before, he had tried to laugh off the frustration, but she could sense that he was really disappointed. Asuna's life hadn't been quite as strict as Korichigu's, but she still too had little experience with games, aside from free downloads on her phone. Even up to her current age, in 9th grade, she was aware of the presence of online games. But the entrance exams for high school were fast approaching, and she had no reason or motive to seek them out, supposedly. So even she had no explanation why, on the afternoon of November 6th, 2022, she had slipped into her brother's vacant room, put the already prepared nerve gear on her head, and spoken the "Link Start" command. The only thing she could say was that everything had changed that day. Everything had ended. Asuna locked herself inside an inn room in the town of beginnings, waiting for the ordeal to be over. But when not a single message had made its way through from the real world in 2 weeks, she gave up hoping for rescue from the outside. And with over 1,000 players already dead, and the first dungeon of this game still unbeaten, she understood that defeating the game from the inside was equally impossible. The only question left now was how to die. She had the option of waiting for months, possibly years, within the safety of the city. But no one could guarantee that the rule that monsters couldn't invade towns would never be broken. Asuna preferred to leave the city rather than curl up into a ball in the dark, living in fear of the future. She'd use all of her instincts to fight, learn, and grow. If she ultimately ran out of steam and perished, at least she didn't spend her remaining days regretting the decisions of the past and mourning her lost future. Run, thrust, and vanish. Like a meteor burning up through the atmosphere. Such was Asuna's mindset as she left the inn and headed out into the wilderness, totally ignorant of a single MMORPG term. She picked out a weapon, learned a single skill, and found her way deep into the labyrinth that no one else had successfully conquered. Finally, at 4 a.m. on Friday, December 2nd, the accumulation of so many battles caused her to black out with exhaustion, and her quest should have ended. The name Asuna, carved into the monument of life beneath Black Iron Palace, would be struck through, and everything would come to a close. It would have. It should have. You shouldn't have, Asuna repeated. The slumping, black-haired swordsman dropped his eyes, dark as night, to the ground. He seemed to be slightly older than she, but the surprising naivety of his gesture surprised her. A few seconds later, her original suspicion returned as a cynical smile crossed his lips. I didn't save you, he said quietly. It was the voice of a boy, but something in it distinguished his actual age. Why didn't you leave me back there? I only wanted to save your map data. If you spent 4 days at the front line, you must have mapped out a good chunk of unexplored land. It would have been a waste to let that disappear. She sucked in a breath at the logic and efficiency of his explanation. She was expecting the same answer that most people she'd met had given her. Some claptrap about the importance of life, or the need for everyone to band together. She'd been prepared to cut through all of that nonsense, verbally, of course, but the practicality of his answer left her speechless. Fine, take it, she muttered, opening her window. She'd finally gotten used to the menu system, tabbing over to access her map info and copying it to a scroll of parchment. Another button command materialized the scroll as an in-game object, and she tossed it to the man's feet. Now you've got what you wanted. So long. She put a hand in the grass to get her feet, but her legs wouldn't stay steady. The clock in her window showed that she'd been out almost a full 7 hours, but her exhaustion hadn't entirely worn off yet. She still had 3 more repairs, though she told herself before she left that she'd stay inside the tower until the last one's durability was below halfway. There were still a few suspicions lurking in the back of her mind. How had the swordsman in the gray coat managed to bring her out of the dungeon in this forest clearing? Why did he take her all the way outside, rather than just to the nearby safe zone within the tower? They weren't worth turning back to ask him about, however. So Asuna turned to her left, in the direction of the black looming labyrinth, and started to march off. Hang on, fencer! She ignored him and kept walking, but what he said next made her stop in her tracks.
You're doing all of this for the purpose of beating the game, right? Not just to die in a dungeon. So why don't you come to the meeting? Meeting? She wondered aloud. The swordsman's explanation reached her ears on the gentle forest breeze. Yeah, there's going to be a meeting tonight at the town of Tablona, near the tower. They're going to plan out how to beat the boss of the first floor labyrinth.